Okay, friends, here we go. This is week 2 of Greater. And what I want to do is introduce you to what we're going to be reading this week and give you a few things to reflect on. I hope that you've got your field notes, and I hope these are helpful to you. I've got my stickers in here in mind for the reading plan, and then can take notes afterwards, and I hope that you're doing that. Also, you may want to take some notes that I'm going to give you just to help set up the reading this week. And what I'm also going to give you is one thing to reflect on each day. So you may want to go ahead and jot those things down as we go also. Okay, so the best way to get into what week 2 is all about is to talk for just a moment about what week 1 and week 3 are all about. So week 1, as you remember from last week, kind of sets the whole stage up. We meet Peter, we see 2 early interactions that he has with Jesus. And then we have 3 days where we see what things were like just kind of following Jesus around, especially day 3 last week. Just kind of a typical day of what it would have been like to follow Jesus around, the amazing things that Peter's seeing. So that kind of sets the stage for the study of Peter. Week 3, we're going to look at the last 24 hours of Jesus' life through the eyes of Peter, and then Jesus' resurrection, again, through the eyes of Peter. So that concludes Jesus' relationship with like the earthly Jesus. And then after that, we'll get into his experience in Acts and his experience with the Holy Spirit and all that stuff, which I can't wait to get into. Week 2, what's going on here? Well, week 2, between what we talked about with week 1 and week 3, is where Peter really begins to understand what's happening at a higher pitch. He begins to get it a little bit more. And what the theme of week 2 really is about is it's about discipleship. Okay, what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? He meets Jesus, he commits to follow him. We get a sense of what that life looks like, just following him around. But this week, we really begin to get a sense of what it means to be someone whose life is turned over to discipleship of Jesus. One way to understand discipleship today is some language that I found really helpful from Dallas Willard, and that is that what it means to be a disciple of Jesus is that it's like you're apprenticing under Jesus. It's like you're seeking to learn to live life the way that he lives it. You're seeking to know what he knows and do what he does, and seeking ultimately to become more and more like him. And that's what we see happening in Peter's life in week 2. Now, by the end of week 2, does he have it? No. But we see him in this process. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of each of these days. Okay, so on Monday, we'll be reading out of Matthew 14. Right before this reading starts, Jesus has fed the 5,000. And after he feeds the 5,000, he quickly rushes his disciples out of there. Go back and read the beginning of Matthew 14 and you'll see this. And it's kind of strange. Why does he want his disciples out of there so quickly? Well, one of the possibilities is that Jesus knows that on the heels of this feeding, the crowds are going to want to anoint him as their king. We see that not in Matthew, but we see that in John. You can put those 2 stories together and see how they each share different details of what happened on that day. But Jesus knows that the people are going to want to make him king. And maybe the reason he wants to get his disciples out of there is he knows that they are not yet ready for the temptation that will come along with their rabbi having that kind of notoriety. That maybe their hearts and their minds aren't ready for that yet. So he goes ahead and he gets them out of there. He sends them on the boat to go to the other side, and that's what sets up what happens in our reading for Monday. Jesus comes walking out on the water. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that here because it's actually what I preached about this morning. So when you get this video on Sunday afternoon, the sermon that morning will have been from September 5th, and I talk a lot about what's happening in that story. So if you want to dig into that passage, you can really get into it there. But bottom line, what this passage does is it gives us a snapshot of what it was like to be a disciple at the time, which helps us to understand why it is that Peter made the bold move in this reading that he did. So as you're reflecting on this day, ask this question. And again, this is kind of a carryover from the sermon, but ask this question. how is it that my discipleship of Jesus, like my apprenticing with Jesus, affects areas of my life that most people would not consider to be religious areas? We well understand how our discipleship of Jesus affects our religious stuff. But for Peter, his discipleship was touching every area of his life. How is it touching areas of your life that maybe are surprising to you and certainly would be surprising to other people? So that taking discipleship to that degree of seriousness. On day 2, Tuesday, we'll be reading out of Mark 8. And Mark 8 is this incredible story of the disciples going with Jesus up to Caesarea Philippi, which is in the far northern reaches of Israel. And one of the things that we're going to give you in the email that this video is attached to is a video that I filmed from when we were there in Caesarea Philippi. So you'll be able to see some of it. But in the walls in Caesarea Philippi, there are these niches that are carved into this this rock face. And at the time of Jesus, there would have been idols, so gods that the people would have worshipped, that were sitting in those niches. So when Peter makes this incredible proclamation that you are the Messiah, you're the Son of God, when he makes this incredible proclamation, he does that quite literally in the shadows of these other things that are competing for his allegiance. It's also that there's a cave right next to these niches that at the time springs were inside the cave poured out of. People thought it was weird there was water coming out of this cave, so they associated it with being the gates of Hades or the gates of hell. It's not in our reading for today, but in the same story in Matthew, Jesus says, look, the church that I'm building on you, Peter, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Again, with the gates of hell, what they believed, the people in Caesarea Philippi believed to be the gates of hell right there. So again, picture being there and what it would be like to have all of these idols that are competing for your allegiance. And to hear Peter say, no, you are the one worthy of following. So on this day, I think it's a good day to reflect on what are the things in our lives that are competing for our allegiance? What are the things that want us to pledge our allegiance to them? What are the things that want to put themselves in the place of God, in the place of Jesus in our lives? Okay, the third day, on Wednesday, we're going to read out of John 6. We'll talk more about John when we read through John, and we'll read through John as a church eventually. But John often has a different take on situations than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He writes with a more poetic flair, a more poetic eye. And this that we're going to read on Wednesday is a short passage that seems to be somewhat of a parallel passage to what we read on Tuesday. So it's just kind of a different take. But it comes on the heels of a really difficult teaching that Jesus gives, and you may want to go back and read that teaching. And keep in mind that if you're reading in your own Bibles, I'm glad you're doing that. But on the app and the website, there's an introductory paragraph to each reading that I put together that will help tie things together. And I talk about this really difficult teaching that Jesus gives. Some people then leave, but Peter makes this proclamation, again, similar to what happened on Tuesday, about this is really difficult to receive Jesus, but how could we trust anybody else more than you at this point? You're the one who has the words of eternal life. So read that, and I think again that this is a day to reflect on, similar to what we did on Tuesday, what's competing for our attention and our allegiance. I think that, but then also, what are the parts of Jesus' message that are particularly difficult for us, particularly difficult for you, and what do you do in response to that? Okay. Day 4, we get into the Transfiguration. On Thursday, we'll read about that. And that is where the glory of Jesus is fully revealed to Peter and 2 others, to James and John. This is where Peter knows, okay, the proclamation that I made on Tuesday is legit. That there is more to Jesus than maybe even then that I realized. This happened 6 days after the proclamation that Peter made. Perhaps at the mountain that Caesarea Philippi is at the base of. So maybe they stayed there for a few days, went up, and bottom line, they see Jesus, these three, in a whole new light. It's a tough passage. As you read it, here I think is what to be reflecting on. How is Jesus and this Jesus thing, this following of Jesus, bigger than I ever imagined that it was? So think about it through that lens. That's what happens for Peter that day. And then on our last day, on Friday, we're going to read out Matthew 18. I'm going to preach on this passage. In a couple of weeks, we're saving it because I want to spend a whole week in Cornerstone on what it looks like to forgive others. So we'll come back to this passage then, on the September 18th, I think it is. So we'll dig into it more then. But as you're reading this, here's what, reflect obviously on what's right there, and that is, who is it that you need to forgive? That's right there. You'll reflect on that. But also reflect on this. Peter, at this point, like up to day 9, knows so much about Jesus. So much has been revealed to him. But even though he knows so much, what we see in day 10 is that he still has so much to learn, not only about who Jesus is, but how to live out his life in response to who Jesus is. And it is one thing to have head knowledge, and it is another thing to allow that head knowledge to change our lives. And what is happening here is that Jesus is taking Peter, and by extension the other disciples, and by extension us, even deeper into what does it look like to actually live this out. Remember our theme verse for the whole year in this Cornerstones thing, not just in Greater, is about being people who build our house on the rock. And Jesus says, who are those folks who build their house on the rock? They're people who hear my words and do them and put them into action. At the end of day 9, Peter knows so much. But we're reminded in day 10 that he still has so much to learn, but he also has so much to implement, so much to live out. So that day, think about who it is that God is leading you towards forgiving, but also think about how it is that God is pushing you towards a deeper level of discipleship, not just in what we know, but also in how we live. This week is all about growing, watching Peter grow as a disciple of Jesus, an apprentice of him. And it is all about us growing in that way also. How is it that we are learning what Jesus knows, living the way that Jesus lives, and ultimately, hopefully, becoming a little bit more and more like Jesus? God bless you, friends. Happy reading this week, and I'll see you next week.